would you rather be a tech billionaire or a toilet cleaning billionaire? Yeah, most people would say tech. It's like, well, I don't really care. I just want to win. When I sold the company, you imminently went through the identity crisis. That is, like, what is life now? Determine for me or define for me what a perfect budget would look like. You can see them kind of thinking through that idea. And the only appropriate answer is, so we were talking about jiu-jitsu. Most people know this throw, this takedown, this submission. It's more, what's this grip and what about my stance and posture? And it's these smaller details that become more important to me because the combination of all those details, they're actually what's driving the bigger outcome, which is want to win, want to make it look easy.
And one of the things you said is the only way to be better than your competitors is to play longer. The only way to play longer is to make less mistakes. How do you make less mistakes in business?
So first thing is, the more isolated you become, the more things you understand and the better you understand and the less relatable your knowledge is to other people's knowledge. And that's fully an individual problem.
You're a father. What's the most important things that you want to teach your kids?
I'm able to help my children get to the point where they realize they don't need love or support from anybody else because they can love and support themselves. They can have their own pride and express their own pride.
But take a moment. What are you most proud of?
That's a very emotionally challenging question to answer.
Welcome to Chew the Fat. In this series, I sit down with high-performance guests and we talk about life, business, and what it takes to be at the top. This is part of my mission to raise $1 million for charity by writing a cookbook called Eat with Purpose. But I'm going to need your help. If you can share the content and leave a review, it's going to make a massive impact. And the bigger the audience, the greater the reach, and the sooner we can get to that $1 million goal. Enjoy the episode. Part of the Chew the Fat tradition is every guest I ask what's your favourite dish and I cook for you. Today is mee goreng.
Do you actually like mee goreng or?
You know what? I actually do like mee goreng.
Okay,
it's my go-to.
It. So I'm not forcing you to eat something you don't like.
It's my go-to on Bali night. I've never made it. I had another guest on who asked for nasi goreng.
Yeah.
And so this is a first.
Okay.
So I'm hoping you enjoy.
Chat and a meal. Big fan.
Do you track your macros?
I used to, like much earlier on, kind of my fitness journey, but I pretty much have changed my approach to, so long as I get the right amount of protein, I don't really care too much about kind of the rest because it takes care of itself.
Yeah.
And I train, like I exercise a lot, and so I can get away with not being super diligent, on some things,
All right, now we'll finish up here and we'll get stuck into the interview. Tobi Pearce, co-founder and CEO, post-exit of Sweat. Welcome to Chew the Fat.
Thanks for having me, mate. Really excited to chat today.
Mate, for everybody that's been hiding under a rock, in just a little nutshell, can you share with me what's the business you co-founded and what was that outcome?
Sure. So effectively after a short career in personal training and being in the fitness industry, I worked through the idea of building an online version of effectively what that would be, which very early on was ebooks.
Yep.
And then as technology changed a bit, eventually became a mobile app. And so, our team built at the time, and I think potentially still now, the world's largest fitness app for women was a mobile app subscription business. We traded in a couple of hundred countries, had sort of 50 million people come through the product and in a really great way, we're able to add a lot of value to a lot of people's lives and health around the world, and also able to sell the business and have a really good exit on the other side of that. And since then, and as a result of my kind of general love and passion for business as a discipline, co-founded a few more businesses, bought a couple, sold a couple, done all that sort of stuff, won some, lost some. But still very much in the game and having a great time.
Love it. Now, one of the things I reflected on, post-exit when I was sitting down, I was writing this little the memoir, if you will, the Instagram memoir, was the person I was the moment I entered that business and the person I became.
Yeah.
And how you fundamentally, the intangible piece, the headline number is everywhere, but the intangible piece is who you are and who you shift.
Yep.
So what's the difference between the Tobi that sits in front of me today to the one that first registered at ABN to start his business?
Yeah, it's just an interesting idea to reflect on. And I think depending on when you ask me that question, at what point in time, I think earlier on, so kind of more recently after the exit, I probably would have suggested that I'd, obviously built a lot of skills and, these sorts of things. Like I started my first business right before the online business, so when I was 19, right? And so the default position would obviously be, well, I built a whole bunch of skills, and people would normally consider those skills to be things like, kind of hiring and managing people, running a business, marketing, sales, whatever they may be. And I certainly value those and rate those things. But I think over time, and after having more exposure to business and a bit more self-reflection, I'd probably actually say the core skill would be self-management, more than anything else. And that the core value that was generated, which in my opinion is kind of much more long-lasting or sustainable, is the emotional development and the identity development, if you will, that occurs on the journey. Because a lot of people can kind of read books and do courses to gain the knowledge. That's one thing, but the capacity to do that whilst under kind of existential threats or pressure, or however you choose to frame that, that's a very unique experience. And so I would say, in a simple sense, I feel like I'm a much more strong, secure, resilient individual as a result of the journey, who also gained some knowledge throughout the process.
And how does that shape what you do now into the future? Like, what do you think that, each day you live, like, what does that bring to you?
Well, in a simple sense, I'm much happier, like much happier. So everyone has their story, motivations, fear and whatever that may be. And for me, like very early on in the journey, I just wanted to win. Like I wanted to win at all costs. The difference is now I still want to win, but I want to be able to do that while having a good time. And I'm very focused on the enjoyment, associated with that. Earlier in my career, I don't care if I sleep, eat, die, it doesn't matter. I'd be pretty open to doing anything to win. And I don't necessarily relate that to working hard. I mean, other kind of sacrifices, the emotional and mental sacrifice. And I think along that journey and a part of that, skill development or progression, if you will, now I feel like I've been able to get to a point where like I can work very hard, be very focused, achieve similar, if not greater results, but do so with almost no stress, almost no worry. I can kind of confront those challenges and be like, oh yeah, awesome. Like, how are we going to kind of win here? How are we going to solve this? As opposed to like, oh crap, like, oh, this could be the end, and then you emotionally spiral. And I think after having spent a couple of years, better part of 5 years now, working with quite a few other founders, I realized that emotional side of the journey is actually the much more challenging aspect. The best example is people who have worked with friends or family for a long time, and objectively, obviously, logically, they probably need to move the person on or change their role. But the emotions associated with making that decision, like I'm working with a client at the moment who's going through this, and he's like, mate, I've been friends with this person for 13 years. I'm like, logically, that has no relevance, to the decision. But emotionally, and to kind of process that in action, that is a very hard piece. And so I think, I really enjoy everything I do now as a result of having the emotional skills and kind of self-regulation capability. It's not actually the knowledge that makes it easier; it's the emotional stuff. Yeah,
because you nailed it, right? You can read about a book about all those different skills, and yes, you've got to practice them to get there. You can't really read about it in the book what it's going to feel like when you've got to let that person go after 13 years of friendship.
No, and I also think that the making the decision is very, very different to understanding the decision. And for a lot of people, if they've been in business for 5+ years and they're generally intelligent and hardworking, they'll kind of figure out the intellectual side of most problems either somewhat quickly, or even if they can't, a small degree of guidance will kind of really help them accelerate to going, I understand this now. But there's a massive difference between understanding it and then actually being able to do it. It's sort of like a lot of people who watch UFC, they can kind of see what's going on, but if you actually put them in the ring, it'd be an interesting thing to watch, right? Kind of understanding and doing are two very different things. And as far as emotions are concerned in business, even something as simple as kind of backing yourself, making investments, risk, they're really hard things emotionally to get around.
100%. And it's something I actually wanted to kind of drill into now, right? So we all see it. We see the content that's out there. We see the podcast. And a lot of the time we focus on the winners and the winning.
Yeah.
You and I are guilty of this because we've joined a few podcasts and it's great and you want to hear from that. But the reality is, like with survivorship bias and what happened in World War II, the planes come back, they've got the bullet holes in them. We're focusing on the bullet holes. What about the ones that have crashed? And so my question is, you're now working with this, this handful or whatever number of founders and people that are going through this journey. What can you share with me with some of the ones that haven't been successful? What are the learning lessons we can get there?
Well, I mean, so one very important and significant insight is that a lot more businesses fail or are on their way to failing and maybe not aware of it yet than a lot of people would think. And I think one of the reasons why that kind of goes under the radar is that most of the media is about celebrating big successes because it's kind of viral and polarizing in some regard, or celebrating big failures.
Yes.
The issue is that other failures that are not big don't ever kind of make their way into that. You know, like that cafe down the road, these 10 guys who tried different tech startups, they never got far enough or big enough to be kind of interesting enough to talk about. But there's a huge population of those people. And then, to follow on from that, I think the second insight would be that most of the time, those organizations are failing because people are focused on the wrong things. Most of the time, those organizations are failing because the founders or management teams are focusing on the wrong things. And the idea of the wrong thing is a very complex idea to explain. But in a simple sense, the thing I observe more consistently than almost anything else is that people are, in a curious way, very focused on what looks good and what looks impressive, as opposed to focusing on what actually generates value. And the idea of generating value seems to be apparently obvious, but very elusive, in some regards. Another, just to provide an example of this, very recently, a person I know sent me a copy of their investment deck. They're like, hey, like not seeking for you to invest, but would really appreciate, some advice kind of going into this, capital raising process. And, the deck, the brand look and feel, kind of the marketing video, the UI design, all of this sort of stuff. I reckon they spent more money doing that than I did building my first 3 businesses combined, but they have no product to show for it. So they've spent a huge amount of money on looking good that, like most investors, don't really care about that. They care about whether or not you look like you can generate value and like, can you show me some value? And so there's so much of this that happens. It's the big brand campaigns. It's a massive creative agency, making your brand stylish and kind of sexy. It's making the product kind of look cool instead of actually being useful. It's the promotion of vanity metrics and the focus on vanity metrics instead of kind of real, true value-driven metrics. And these are all, coming back to something we spoke about earlier, these are all emotional issues. They're not actually intellectual issues. People are subconsciously, in some regards, emotionally driven to the idea of status and looking cool and looking to be winning, as opposed to being like, well, what's our kind of growth rate? Like, what are our core metrics? What are our margins? These sorts of things. And like, when was the last time that you saw a business article saying, this company's done a great job at improving their margins? Like, pretty much never. It doesn't exist, right? But to a person who is not emotional, and tries to be very objective about the investment, like, that's one of the most important things I'm looking at. I'm like, well, where are your margins at? Like, how's that going? How are you managing your cash flow? But no one's really ever kind of talking about that. Yes. And so I think as far as the companies that fail, there's a lot more of them, 1, and 2, they're really just focused on the wrong things, which is largely an emotional issue, I believe.
It's really interesting as you share that, and you probably might have noticed the smile on my face multiple times because you hit so many things that I've been recently encountering. And it's like, to your point there, right, is that you got to pitch to the investor. Some of those things are hygiene and it's just expected. So when I'm showing you my slide deck, I just expect it not to look like dog shit.
Yeah, but it's going to be good enough. It doesn't need to be great. And the gap between good enough and great is huge, like logically, but emotionally, people go like, oh, it has to be perfect. And I'm like, well, for most people, in the case of raising money, well, how many times do you raise money? 0. Okay. How do you know what perfect is? You don't. The only thing that matters, either do or don't have success raising capital, right? But they're not focused on the value, It's a fascinating thing to watch.
And I see it. It's something I'm wrestling with at the moment, right? There's people who are doing an incredible job in their fields. And so I'll give an example, Stephen Bartlett. And when he came out and did a talk on stage, he talked about the 1%ers and the details. And in his context, when you have a business that's his podcast, that he's already had multiple businesses, that makes perfect sense, right? So how do you become the number 1 player? How do you become the Michael Jordan? You've got to focus on those. Yeah. I think that's a bit of a trap for the early stage founders.
100%.
Because they don't yet know what the 1%ers that matter. And so the nuance of your brand color and logo doesn't yet matter because you don't have a product to sell.
No, and in advance, for any people who work in brand and marketing who might be listening to this, I would argue quite confidently that I'm not sure most people actually know about the 1%ers and whether they actually add value or not, functionally.
Yes.
And what I mean by that, so just one of the one of the more basic examples. Most marketing agencies and or somewhat sophisticated digital marketers will go, oh, well, we do kind of A/B testing, this, that, and the other, right? And principally, like from an experimentation standpoint, either using kind of the scientific method or however people want to think about this. In a general sense, we run an experiment to prove something's true. That's what most people think. Normally, it's actually about proving untruths because proving something true is actually incredibly complicated. We can touch on that later maybe. But if we look at this as a simple experiment, an A/B test between two landing pages, if you change more than a couple of small variables, so kind of colors, font sizes, design, imagery, call to action, language, messaging, positioning, product, whatever it may be, pricing, all these things, right? If you change kind of more than 2 or 3 of those, it can be incredibly complicated to actually distill not only what has won, but most importantly, why, right? Now, that's in a somewhat closed environment. And when I say a closed environment, I mean, I can go, well, 10,000 people went to both pages. We assume they were, from a demography standpoint, we run on the assumption they're roughly similar traffic. Maybe we did this through Facebook, so we have a pretty hygienic audience list. So some of those variables are somewhat in control. The measurement is in some regards quite refined and simplistic. A person did or didn't take an action that we wanted them to take, maybe buy or whatever it may be. That's a pretty closed environment, right? But if you're on organic social media, well, you pretty much can't prove any of that because when you post, what you post, how you post, who sees it, who's online, who engages with it, there's so many variables, almost none of which you're either A, in control or B, aware of. It's really hard to go, actually, this color works better. Politely, a lot of it's crap, right? And so not only is the idea of focusing on the 1% as just in general kind of dangerous, I would suggest in some regards, it's just ignore whether they're 1% or 100%. The important thing is is it actually value adding and will it stand up to simple logic and reason? And I commonly refer to one of my first principles in business, is that every decision that you make is an investment decision. And if you don't frame it as an investment decision, then you're not making a decision in a responsible way. So one of the best and most simple examples is hiring an employee. People kind of go, oh, what's the employee cost? Oh, the market says 150K. Yep, cool, great, let's go. And there's no well, hold on. We're actually trying to solve this problem. Employment or full-time employment is one option. There's full-time, there's part-time, there's casual, there's contracted. We could onshore, we could offshore, we could find tech. And all of that's actually a secondary question to is it actually even worth solving? To begin with, right? And so a lot of people kind of avoid this really simplistic approach to reasoning their own decisions because they're already too emotionally kind of bought in to the outcome, sounding cool, or they listen to some podcast where someone who did something that worked for them and maybe it worked for them. That might not have even been what actually made them work. They've kind of taken that out of that context and then run with it. So
it's so interesting you share that. And something I heard the other day, funnily enough, on a podcast was Elon Musk talking about how they make changes on the factory floor and from an engineering standpoint. And his baseline is, do we need this thing?
It doesn't need to exist at all.
Does it need to exist at all? So someone's like, we need to change this or optimize this or do this or does this need to exist? Yeah. And so we start that as the starting off point. Is before we go and optimize the font, the color, the logo, the call to action, the product button.
Yep.
Does it need to exist?
Yeah. And I think one of the principles he uses in his decision making from an engineering standpoint is that never ever over engineer something that shouldn't have existed to begin with. Right? Don't optimize or improve something that doesn't belong. Right? And that's from that whole idea of people management. That's, in my opinion, probably one of the biggest mistakes. People try to manage and support and develop employees in roles and or for work or responsibilities that probably don't actually even need to be there. They don't even need to exist. And a lot of people will get upset, hearing information like that because oh, well, but I don't just want to get rid of them. It's their job, it's their life. And I'm like, yes, but you have a responsibility to the organization, whether you own it or are employed or a director or an investor, whatever it may be. You have a responsibility to use logic and reason to make decisions at an absolute kind of basic level. But again, then the emotions will, interfere with that.
So let's drill into the people management side. Now, the types of people listening is going to be from all different shapes and sizes, from starting a business to having big business and think about it. The reality of business is it can be quite simple. If you find the right people, attract the good talent, put them in the right spot and allow them to grow and retain them, you can kind of solve all problems. Yeah. And so my question to you is, how did your people management shape, change? Yeah. And what do you think fundamentally was the most important thing that created the success that was allowed the company to be acquired?
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm a real believer in trying to answer these questions with a combination of what would my answer be now,
Yes.
with some honesty and truth about what actually would have been happening earlier in the journey. And so when I say that, what I mean is a lot of people will be on podcasts saying, I do this, and this. I'm like, but that's kind of, in a nuanced way of phrasing it, that's not available, mentally or experientially to people who are very early in their journey. Those things are kind of almost out of reach. They've got to kind of go through the pain in some regards to develop. So the honest, truth is that early on I was really terrible at people management. Like, it was probably one of my weakest areas, and my primary issue was that I could never understand how to get other people to understand. That was a real big problem for me, and motivating them and this, that, and the other. So frankly, early on I was very ineffective. As the years went on and I got supported by some great people around me and did some of my own learning and development, I came to a couple of really fundamental conclusions which progressively helped me make better decisions and kind of set people up for success in a better manner. And so some of those are kind of the idea that the whole point in people management is that you can generate commercial returns from people. And so if we use the principle that all investments in business are investment decisions, well, then we are really spending X to get Y, and the salary is kind of a part of the spend, right? And so you use that as a general idea, it makes you much more considerate about how you define, something as basic as a position description, right? Who are we hiring and what actually for? We're not just hiring to resolve a pain point, we're investing in a result, right? And so that's a very subtle distinction. Most people go, I'm overwhelmed, this person can't keep up, I'll recruit someone, right? Well, so are you investing in more productivity? Are you investing in greater outcomes, or do you need to work on solving a different problem with that person, right? So if the headlines are really about, kind of generating commercial returns in people, then all of your decisions need to be effectively based on that. And so, when you onboard a person, your investment in creating a great employee onboarding is that they can become effective quicker. Your investment in a kind of healthy, fair, honest, and reasonable performance management cycle, monthly, quarterly, or whatever it may be, that's an investment in making sure that you can help people develop and grow. If you are making investments into learning development, either individually or in groups, that's an investment in lifting the baseline level of capability and skill in the organization. These are not things I understood at the beginning. It was like, hey, so you're a marketing person? Cool. Well, can you run our ads? And then like a month or 2 or 3 months later, I'm like, well, what the hell is going on with the ads? You're losing us money. And they're like, well, I don't really know what success is, right? And so all of these things, onboarding people the right way, and giving them really simple goals to work towards, making sure they have the right tools, systems, process, and support, they seem obvious, right? I'll give you a clear job. I'll tell you what the work is I want you to do. I'll tell you how to measure success. I'll kind of give you the tools or whatever that you need to do it. That sounds really easy. But then as a founder, when you're trying to do that in finance, HR, ops, marketing, sales, product management, engineering, content, whatever it may be, like how the hell do you know what all those things are? And unfortunately, most people, even the ones who are doing the role, they don't even know the answer to all of those things, right? And so people management is very kind of elusively simple but hyper complex at the same time. But those kind of headline statements around thinking of it an investment is, in my opinion, kind of the best guiding principle, because it holds you accountable to your own decision making, which makes it easier to figure out what works with them and doesn't.
All right, Toby, you've inspired me, right? Your words there where you just said, we jump on a podcast and we jump to, this is what I do, and it makes it sound like everything's great. You've inspired me to share a terrible story that hopefully you can judge me and everybody can go, holy shit, Frank. People management. Here was my version of people management on like employee number 2. So I had a view that everybody had to arrive perfectly on time.
We all started this way.
And this one person would arrive every day at 9 a.m. on the dot. Perfect. But he would time it that he would go to the bathroom for a number 2 for about 25 minutes every day.
Coffee. Yeah.
And so I thought it was totally appropriate to have a word with him. Hey, mate, if you're going to have a shit, you got to do it earlier. Which is just terrible.
Yeah,
so
super healthy. Yeah.
So everybody, we don't start perfect, right? Something I'm noticing as you're talking is this: you've kind of got a framework which kind of pulls back into first principles.
Yeah.
Firstly, where did that come from, and like how are you sharing this and helping people understand that? Because it's very logical in its approach, and it's my ears are pricking up as you do it.
So, and perhaps this is an interesting insight into my level of people management skill earlier on. So when I sold the company and imminently went through the identity crisis. That is like, what is life now? As a part of that, very kind of isolating period of time, I spent a lot of time reflecting on like what am I the worst at as far as that role or job, CEO, whatever you want to call it. What am I kind of the worst at? What really held me back? And one of the areas that I identified was people management. And so I was like, well, as an interesting and incredibly frustrating challenge, I will write a book on people management. Yes. Right. And so over the next couple of months, I sat there and, kind of wrote down the better part of 100,000 words on literally how do I simplify kind of every core idea or aspect of this? How can I simplify things down to, a single sentence, like these really complicated ideas, so like people go like, oh, what's culture? And it's like, well, that's our standard and representation of accepted behavior in our business. Okay. Yep, cool. Well, what's engagement? Well, that's the way people feel about the culture and the standards. Okay. Well, what's the purpose of people management? Well, generate commercial returns from people. And these are really simple answers, but they took me a really long time, to figure out. And so in a funny kind of way, developed this and, created that content. And quite a long time later, one of the people I work with at Sweat, who actually ran our people and culture department, we actually ended up then setting up like a HR consultancy and recruitment firm on the side to use this as a product to test with other organizations, which is a recent development, but one that's been really enjoyable because, it works, right? And the education process works. And so now, in a really funny way, I've spent some time turning what was one of my kind of least strong skills, into a very, very big strength of mine. I literally run learning and development sessions for executive teams on how to manage people. And like how to think about the problems and solve them, which is a really ironic kind of outcome given the starting point, which, I mean, there wasn't anything to do with poos, but I was not that far away, from that in a decision-making perspective.
I love it. And that, the one area here, the distilling down, did that come from anywhere? Or are you just thinking, okay, did it just come naturally to you, go like, these are complex, I've got to make them distill down? Because it's like first principles way of thinking is a very different way of thinking.
It's very hard.
It's very hard.
Yeah, and a lot of the time people, they because all language is effectively subjective insofar as your understanding or belief around certain words is in some regards different to everyone. And one of the funniest exercises is just to ask someone to define a word without using the word. Yeah. Like it's a really interesting experience. But anyway, we won't labor on that. But I think for me, after leaving the business, and I've always, well, not always, but for the majority of my business journey, been quite studious and curious. I spent a lot of time researching and studying. And I often came along this idea or this experience that, this is a 600-page book. It's actually wonderful. This is some really good shit. But it probably could have been 60 pages. Yeah. And why do people not want to do the learning and development or the study? Because it's quite laborious. They kind of want to get to the value. And don't get me wrong, I think the pain and time is important in the development. But a lot of the time, the actual value gets lost amongst an extra 50,000 words that perhaps didn't need to, be there. And so part of the exercise I went through, and this is one of the principles I kind of live by, I'm like, if you understand something very well, not just you understand it, but if you understand it on a very intimate level, well, you'll be able to explain it very simply, right? And as I went through, I realized, I was like, I kind of generally understand these ideas, but it's taken me a very long time to actually communicate, what they are. And so then after having finished, I was like, well, I'm going to do this all over again. And literally went back and started the entire thing again and took the headline sections and said, well, how would I do this in like a paragraph or a page, as opposed to 30 pages? And a part of the realization of that, like condensing that, that content was that it's really bloody hard to simplify things. But when you are able to, and you do the work to eventually get there, the value of communication, it's not like 10% better or 50% better. It's like 100 times better. And the cut through with other people and other organizations is much, much better as well, because there's less to think about, right? I don't need to do a 30-page presentation explaining culture. I can do 2 slides. End, right? And so, honestly, it's probably one of the most enjoyable, like individual journeys I've been on from a learning standpoint, which is quite strange because I never thought that writing would be valuable. And now I'm at the other end of the spectrum. I'm like, write everything because there's so much value in reflection.
I love it. And it's interesting as you share that, because I'm thinking about the contextual takeaway for someone listening, even down to the person who's in the early stages of business.
Yep.
Just verbalizing and soundboarding either your ideas or the problems or the commercial drivers or the different aspects of your business, the more you do, the more verbalizing you are doing, the better and sharper it becomes. You and I were chatting.
You're just sculpting a stone.
Exactly. You and I were chatting before this podcast, talking about the power of public speaking, the power of jumping on a podcast, the power of trying to, the challenge I'm going through right now is like, business can be difficult. There are certain things that it's really hard to get into a 60-second reel. Yep. And for me, I can do probably a few more words than necessary. And so sometimes I come there, I'm like, damn it, why is my reel not performing? Because, or you do it, but it's like trying to distill that value into 60 seconds. But the more you do it, the better you become and the better you can articulate. Because I think you nailed something there, which is like in business, I see it so often people use like acronyms, like at the moment.
Alliteration or acronyms to remember things,
Like, I'm in you're in the like entrepreneurial circles, and they all want to use you all want to use the argoos and the cagoos and this and that, and then you're like, there's so many people that don't know what you're saying.
No idea.
And no one will want to say to you, I don't understand, because they don't want to look like an idiot. Yeah. So they let it pass through
all the time,
and you'll miss actually what you're trying to convey to them.
Yeah, it's effectively in one ear out the other. Yeah, and not only like that, and honestly, you've touched on a very important point, one I very much love talking about. I actually, as a really interesting example, in my learning and development sessions with people on people management, depending on the company, but for example, let's use an e-commerce company. I would say, look, the opening exercise we're going to do today is we're going to divide the room into two parts, and I want you to define CAC, right, or customer acquisition cost for those of you at home who are not aware. And so I'm like, all you need to do is define it in one sentence, and then in using dot point form, 1 or 2 words each, articulate to me the expenses or cost lines that are included in the cost, right? And every single organization has a completely different, like each group is like they're completely opposite ends of the spectrum in defining CAC. I'm like, cool. So that's one of your maybe top 15 operating metrics in the business.
Yeah.
And none of you even know what is what. So how can you possibly expect to effectively make decisions if you don't even know what it is that you're deciding about, right? And that's only defining it. That's not even including the context upon, which it is relevant. Like from a marketing perspective, there's always great debates around, is it CAC or ROAS?
Yeah.
It's like, well, it's neither and both. It's this one in that context and it's that one in this context. It's neither in joint form. They're effectively redundant combined, but they're valuable independently, right?
That's actually really interesting. Do you know what else is interesting? The Eat with Purpose cookbook. It's part of my mission to raise $1 million for charity. This podcast is a part of that goal, and what you can do is like, comment, share, and leave us a review. Let's get back to the guest.
But because people don't understand the definitions, they can't even get to the point of, well, contextually, where is it relevant, right? But of course, online, we can do 60-second reels and use a hook to kind of like pull you in, educate you, not at all, but motivate you and inspire you to think that, well, you could make $1 billion if you just do this one thing. And then imminently the 10,000 people that liked it get upset because it doesn't actually work in practice.
Here's how to simply increase your ROAS to make $1 billion company.
Yeah. And anyway, it's $0 later. So it's not like I would never ever want to come across as hacking away at these people, because I think a lot of what they're doing is good. They're bringing attention to business, they're inspiring people and motivating people, and I think that's a very positive thing. But unfortunately, and especially our social media society, if you will, is much more incentivized by entertainment than it is by education. But business only ever wins through education, not through entertainment. So you can't be an entertaining leader to the point of generating better margins, right? You have to be an educated leader to the point of generating better margins. And so they're kind of at odds with each other.
I love it. Now, a quote I saw online that you said the other day, and I'm going to be honest with you, Toby. Some of the things you say, because you have distilled them so well, I'm a bit of a fanboy. And sometimes I responded to your stories going, fuck, you there's a scramble of words here. You've been able to distill it down. And it's exactly the words that came out of my head. And now I'm going to use that and pretend it was me. So thank you.
Claim it as much as you like, mate.
And one of the things you said is the only way to be better than your competitors is to play longer. The only way to play longer is to make less mistakes. And so I want to get really specific.
Sure.
How do you make less mistakes in business?
Yeah, so in a general sense, so we should start from the position that you're never going to not make any mistakes. But the goal is to make less mistakes kind of as a percentage of your total decisions, if you will, and that the mistakes that you do make progressively over time become on a relative basis less damaging to what you're doing. And so if you want to kind of make the progress, and if you were talking about competition, business A versus business B, in a really simple sense, the one that will win will be the one that makes better decisions. right? So that's the ultimate first principle. A lot of people go, oh, but it's about product or marketing. It's like their decisions.
Yeah.
Right. So it's the decision quality that in some regards mandates the outcome if we're in a simple world, excluding, other conditions that we can't be aware of, right? COVID's scenarios and whatever, for example. And so if you kind of pull that thread and you go, I want to make better decisions would largely be represented by kind of less mistakes over time or greater efficacy or effectiveness in decision making. Well, then in a simple sense, the only way to actually do that is to have a very good learning process or a very good feedback loop, right? And a feedback loop that is ideally, in some regards, in inverted commas, scientific, insofar as it's kind of measured.
Yep.
We're designing these decisions so that we can look at them retrospectively to determine whether or not it was a good decision and this sort of stuff. And so the idea of making less mistakes in a really simple way comes from measuring a lot of what you do or all of what you do. And, that idea will typically receive a couple of responses. Oh, well, that seems like a lot of effort. I'm like, well, is losing more or less effort than being disciplined? Is it more upsetting? Or people will say, oh, we do measure things, right? It's like, but measuring is a component of learning and decision making. It's not the only central idea. And so the simple idea that I often implement with organizations is, and from a learning development standpoint, I ask people the question, what would be a representation of someone's budgeting skill being flawless? Explain to me, right? Determine for me or define for me what a perfect budget would look like. And 90% of people or more will turn around and go, oh, yes, you just smash the numbers, you just kill it, you just, 100% up, rah. And I'm like, well.
That'd be incorrect.
Well, I'd say you're terrible at budgeting. Because that's like saying if you tried to drive from Adelaide to Melbourne, success would be Queensland. That's effectively the equivalent, right? And a lot of people kind of sit there for a second and they're like, you can see them kind of thinking through that idea. And the only appropriate answer is that, the perfect budget is one that has zero variance anywhere, right? Which almost never happens. And so therefore, if you want to get better at making decisions and you want to build this feedback loop, one of the best feedback loops is actually having a really good budgeting process and a reforecasting process. And the reason for that is that every time you do your budget, a lot of people will say, oh, the success of this was whether we performed well or not. And I'm like, that's not untrue, but perhaps a stronger truth would be that your performance actually was, well, how accurate were you at predicting what happened in the future? So was your revenue 20% up or 2% off? Were your costs 20% off or 2% off? All the way down to your operating metrics, was your churn 90% or 88%? And what's the variance? And so typically what happens is, for the first couple of quarters, that budgeting process has very big variance because people are like, oh, we can achieve this. And they're like, oh, fuck, actually, okay, no, we can't, right? And so then every quarter that goes by, people, they get more and more frustrated at the idea that they can't predict things, and the only real barrier is honesty, because they often want the budget to look good, coming back to the same emotional thread. But as they start to accept that, what you eventually get to the point is where you can predict the future better. And if you can predict the future better, that means that your decisions are more accurate to reality. And if you can make decisions that are better and more accurate to reality, you can have more confidence that when you're going to do things, they'll play out. And if you can do that repeatedly again and again and again and again and again, well, you will beat the people you're competing against. And a lot of people want to say, oh, that's a gross oversimplification. It's like, well, why did Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger pretty much beat all other investors? They made the same decisions that you did to choose or not choose to invest in people. They've refined over decades, their process, right? Why do other very large organizations, Apple or whatever, like why can they do things better than people? It's like, well, they've got 40 years of progressively improving decisions. And you're looking at, founders who've been in the game for 2 years, thinking, oh, I'm going to beat all my competitors. It's like, well, it's not untrue. You might be smarter and be naturally, talented, but for the rest of us mere mortals, the reality is that the focus and the process must be on decision-making. And decision-making is largely best represented by budgeting or experimentation, depending on, the way you want to look at it.
Boom. That is so good. I love that. That's fucking epic. Something that's coming to my mind, definitely not written down. Hopefully I say this with the right tone and respect that I should. I can see the challenge that could have been. And what I mean by that, as you said to me, and something I saw on the podcast, is your brain is working at an incredibly fast pace.
Yeah.
And I can imagine that in those early days of the employees, that as that pace and your ability to use words that feel really simple, the cut through would have been...
Well, I had no awareness, and like this is, some people struggle with this for a very long time in their life. And I think in general sense, life is actually a kind of journey to self-discovery progressively.
Yes.
Even still, right? But yeah, I think early on I had no awareness of that, that idea or concept, right? So I didn't know that XYZ didn't make sense to other people. And I had no awareness because I didn't know that other people didn't read and study the same way. And I also know that I didn't understand that people weren't kind of as curious or passionate or obsessed, or whatever word you want to use, about business. And that probably took me 5 years to even realize that it existed, let alone the next 5 years to actually try to figure out how to make that useful. Unfortunately, earlier on, my kind of energy and drive in some regards was, and in some environments was quite destructive for team culture. And to be honest, I feel, through observation that's not unique to me. There's a lot of founders that are kind of super driven, motivated, passionate. They have, like to the ordinary non-founder person, perhaps they would have a weird obsession with strange details that don't matter. They care about the shit that just doesn't matter, but for some reason it keeps working. And so, a lot of the time, people who are kind of crazy enough to start businesses, they see the world in a different way to most people. And that's not right, wrong, or good or bad, better or worse. It's just different, right? But that difference is what allows them to get the cut through, that they're after. But it also is what creates a lot of connection problems with other people because they can't relate, on the same way. And that was definitely, and in some regards, even for me still, like I find it very hard to relate to a lot of people. That's just a part of my nature. Challenge I have to, work on.
Yeah.
So
it's like the more information you know, the more simplified the constructs become in your mind.
Yeah.
The gap becomes larger, almost.
Yeah, I can't remember. There's someone much more wise than I made. It was a quote around this idea that effectively the more you learn, the more isolated you become. The more things you understand and the better you understand, and the less relatable your knowledge is to other people's knowledge. And that's fully an individual problem. It's not anyone else's problem. It's actually your problem. So like even in going back to the writing the book, and people management, that has been quite fascinating because even as I simplified it, I got to this point, I was like, oh God, I've simplified this. This is something everyone's going to understand this. And they understand the content. And then 2 weeks later, you're like, what, you're doing something that's completely the opposite. Like what? And so knowledge and skill are different, understanding and agreement or belief is different again, and so that's why a lot of this kind of skill development and success is not, you can't watch just a 60-second reel. You've kind of got to live it, in some regards.
And what's your feedback loop? Like, what's your feedback loop to like clearly at the core of you is like, you want to get better. Like it's very obvious. Yeah. What's the feedback loop that you're checking in with yourself to go like, where are the things that I need to focus on?
Yeah. I think over time, as you go on your development journey, the goals obviously change because you set a goal and you achieve it. I think for me at the moment, alongside the obvious thing, so if you put yourself in a management position in a general sense, the obvious low hanging fruit is like, well, I want to perform, and performance would typically be most simply looked at, well, did you hit your numbers? So as a CEO or founder, you're kind of looking at the big financial drivers, customer acquisition drivers, all of these sorts of things. Then after a while, if you are perhaps quite detail oriented and obsessed, you get to a point where you go, okay, well, I understand enough about the dynamic of business, the market, strategy and competition that the results are not necessarily a foregone conclusion, as in you're not necessarily always going to win. But in this environment, I think I can kind of roughly hit these numbers. And because you get quite sophisticated at forecasting, you're like, yep, I'm kind of roughly achieving that. Let's see how far we can push that. But that kind of becomes then less important because you have a method and a system for doing that. And so over the last year or so, for me, for example, a lot of my goals have actually been around, well, how do I master the whole machine? So not so much just, can we get the results, but how could I do it with like the least amount of my time? How can if I'm going to recruit 10 people, can I get 10 winners? Because most people will miss a couple. If I'm kind of trying to design the operating, framework for a company, the culture, reporting systems, the strategy, how well can I do that? And so like even simple things like a lot of companies do, employee engagement surveys. And for me, like I'm sitting here obsessing over the score of like, well, out of 10, how many people feel like they can clearly understand what the priorities are for the business? Like that's a thing for me at the moment, right?
Yeah.
You know, if I'm trying to advise an organization, you know, through a particular experience, let's say I'm trying to implement like a new business performance reporting system. Well, success for me would be, can I do it once? Can I get maximal understanding? And can it require no rework, right? And that sounds really like nuanced and tiny and kind of almost redundant or irrelevant, but it's because the bigger things like, can we generate results, recruit good people, do a strategy, those things kind of become easier over time. And then it's these kind of much more refined things, and you realize that these details, the small details, are in some regards actually the infinitely more valuable characteristics of skill. And so perhaps to create another example, so we were talking about jiu-jitsu, and I'll use any excuse to talk about jiu-jitsu, but we're talking about before, and a lot of people early in their journey go like, oh, I'm going to learn this takedown, this throw, I'm going to learn this submission, whatever it may be. But then like later on in the journey, and I'm okay, but I'm definitely not an athlete.
So you could take Kai and I down, but...
Well, you cooked me a meal, so maybe we can, at the end of this, we can do a wrestle. But no, the more you go through that learning journey, the more you realize that, yes, those things are important, but they're foregone knowledge. Most people know this throw, this takedown, this submission, but it's more, what's this grip, and what about my stance and posture, and what are they doing, and what tells do they have? It's these really tiny details, and they actually result in the success, because all the other stuff is quite vanilla. And so as you progress further in your journey in any skill, and in this context, business, it's these smaller details that become more important to me, because the combination of all those details, they're actually what's driving the bigger outcome, which is want to win, want to make it look easy, right? Like that's the two kind of guiding principles, if you will.
Fuck. Yeah. I feel I'm impressed today. I think everybody will be able to hear that in my voice. Is there like a big number game that you want to do? Like, do you have it in your mind? And I know money isn't the objective, but do you have it in you that you're like, I want to make $1 billion company?
Well,
because and the reason I say that is I'm going off piece today, guys.
Yeah.
The reason I say that is as you started to articulate and you started to go all those different things, I'm like, fucking hell, like this, like, as you have all of those different elements done, I'm like, that's, then you refine them down and they're like, let me see if I can do this on the big cojones.
I think the idea of, let's approach it this way, right? The idea of making heaps of money and that being a representation of your skill level is a very vulnerable position to take, right? And the reason for that is because there is a huge amount of people who are not actually, in inverted commas, that good at business, who have made a huge amount of money. There's a lot of right place, right time. And there's also a lot of wrong place, wrong time, right? So like you could be a full-blown genius at business, if you will, but just could be living at a really bad time with a really bad set of interests. And so what I mean by that is that, a lot of people will go, oh, well, you're great at business. Maybe you can just go and build any company. It's like, but that would be the logical part of the equation, but not the emotional part, because business is such a complex and, kind of emotionally, draining journey, if you will. You really have to have like a genuine interest, right? You have to be genuinely curious or interested in what you're doing. So could I go and build an e-commerce company selling towels or rocks or cameras or tables? And probably I understand the fundamentals of that particular business, but it would emotionally be quite challenging for me because it's not something I'm interested in. Now, to simplify the response, like, would I like to go ahead and build bigger businesses and do more things and make more money? Well, great. That'd be a great scoreboard, to look at. But I don't necessarily have like a one-to-one attachment between, my knowledge, capability and confidence and, money, because over time I've become more accepting, I guess, and educated in my understanding that, the skill level and even the emotional skill aspect, like that doesn't make money. The opportunity has to align, the timing has to align, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I would also argue, a lot of the things that I am knowledgeable about and or interested in, they're at a really interesting time right now. Like I'm interested in tech, but I'm not necessarily good enough to currently ride some of the really interesting waves that are happening, and that's not interesting enough to me, right? So for me, part of the challenge is I look at this as like, it's like one of the things I'm doing at the moment in my own investments is like, how can I kind of buy, grow, transact really boring busises, but implement really sophisticated operating methods into it, because there's lots of money there. So like one of the I've got to be careful here. one of the organizations that I'm engaging with at the moment to take a substantial ownership in has been around for quite a while. They're in services and they have actually done quite a good job of building a decent brand in their space. I think they've been around for over 10 years now, but they've struggled to operate, right? And so over the last 9 months, we've taken with a few very basic things. We haven't even increased sales volume. With a few very basic rules and principles, we've taken the company from nearly losing money or kind of making 30 to 50K a month profit to doing upwards of $200,000 to $250,000 a month in profit, right? And so to me, from an investment and ROI perspective, and also I don't work in it, I don't manage it, I don't do any of that. It's just a part of my method and system. To me, I'm like, well, that's winning. It doesn't matter if it goes into be $1 billion. I'll just do 50 of them. Like it makes no difference, right? And so I think to me, the money is not the immediate driver. Like winning to me is not as simple as just, dollars. Like I said before, it's winning and it's also making it happen like it's easy.
I love that.
That's where I want to be.
Can we drill into that for a second? Because there's those fundamentals you just said. You've gone from 50 to 250 from a profit standpoint. Give me 2 examples of what you did there that drove that.
Sure. And I would be quite confident that for most small to medium sized businesses and potentially even more in large businesses that these apply. First thing is I look at a P&L like a spare bedroom, right? It accumulates shit that's normally worth a lot of money that never gets used, right? And so one of the first things I do with organizations is I ask them to empty the spare bedroom, right? And sell everything they're not going to use and things that they can otherwise use and make use of, start making use of it. Otherwise, you can't keep it in the spare bedroom. It's no longer a storage room, right? And so with this particular organization, and then just to be clear, I've done this with probably 20 or 30 businesses in the last 12 months. They were able to reduce kind of across the board. So when I say operating expense, I don't mean OPEX, I mean the total expenses to operate the business. So COGS, cost of sales, actual OPEX, and other bits and bobs. They were able to cut their costs in a general sense by over 30%, whilst having no change in productivity, service delivery, sales throughput, none, right? So that's the first point, right? Then the second point is, which is not unique, but for this particular business model, it's a large lever, is looking at the way that they deliver their service, right? So how can we use what I would refer to as knowledge work to increase the productivity of labor, right? And so labor, kind of in a simple sense is, units of output per period of time. Knowledge work is non-linear. So how can I use IQ and intellect and experience and knowledge to make this system or process increase the rate of productivity per unit in the labor? And so in some regards, for their particular business and industry, it's a little difficult to perfectly measure, but it's probably sort of 30 to 40% increase in productivity, which then resulted in a further reduction in salary and wages quite substantially as a result of it, and an increase in margins. And maybe a bonus point, because the third point then goes to the service piece, is then we did a significant review of their pricing. And in some particular kind of product or service S categories, they had they were able to charge 60 to 70% more and sell the same amount. So changing nothing, right? Just normalizing the price. And that all comes to having a margin goal and these sorts of things, right? So the idea of kind of cost reductions, optimizing service delivery, and then kind of, I would say in this case, it was normalizing pricing. Able to have an incredibly big impact, not actually doing anything complicated. Very boring, but emotionally draining stuff. If you're going to say to the owner, hey, I need you to go kind of fire these 15 employees. I want you to close these subscriptions. I want you to remove these costs because they're not really necessary or useful. I want you to sublease that part of the office because it's been empty for 2 years. Like these sort of things. And then all of a sudden it's like, an extra $250,000 a month profit. So like it's a good place to be.
That's epic. I had the biggest smile on my face as you started talking about the services thing, because I'm really bullish. I think some of the best and brightest minds have been running towards tech and the next thing, and it's the, like guilty, but it's like like the AI, the this, all of the stuff. And it's like, there's a lot of these businesses, like there hasn't been another Jim's mowing.
No,
do you know what I mean? There's a lot of these like services-based businesses with the tech enablement, with like you deem the knowledge work, that I think could be just absolutely huge businesses. And the beauty is they're not sexy.
No, and they're very resilient too. And to be honest as well, this in a general sense in investing, this principle applies. So if something is growing really rapidly, super sexy, and everyone's talking about it, you're already too late. Right? So when you look at service businesses, like, well, how many people right now are talking about like toilet cleaning? Like none. How many people are talking about skip bins? None. right? There's a guy, I don't think he's Aussie, but I think he lives in Australia, who built a several $billion business, which is effectively about skips and waste disposal. And you've probably never heard of the guy,
Yeah.
right? And so when you look at these sorts of things and coming back to the whole interest alignment, skill thing before from a business goals perspective, a lot of the time there's lots of great opportunities sitting around, but emotionally they're not cool. Would you rather be a tech billionaire or a toilet cleaning billionaire? Most people would say tech. It's like, well, I don't really care. I just want to win. And so getting to that point of emotional balance, if you will, it's a wild superpower because you can just focus on the winning, not what, where, why, when, how the winning, just the winning. It doesn't matter what it is, just win. Right?
Love it. I'm going to shift gears as we kind of start to finish up. You're a father.
Mm-hmm.
What's the most important things that you want to teach your kids?
Yeah. I think you're in a simple sense, in one word, independence, right? But the expanded form of that would be emotional independence, intellectual independence, these sorts of things. So like, I ideally, in the most respectful, loving, caring, and supporting way, I can rapidly facilitate a high amount of exposure to disappointment, pain, and struggle in a controlled environment, right? So that they can build the individual skill to tolerate, withhold, and persevere through that. Because in a general sense in life, kind of emotional, intellectual independence, capacity to take care of yourself, I think is, in a simple sense, like a universally underrated skill. And I think too, a very recent experience for me, I got my brown belt in jiu-jitsu, which is, as far as people who are in martial arts concerned, they would probably think that's interesting and cool, right? On the street, not so much, no one cares. But no, so I had no expectation that I was going to receive that, truly. And my immediate emotional response was like, well, I'm not deserving of this. I'm not good enough yet. I don't know enough yet. And this brought to me through my own reflections a really interesting idea around pride. I went through this process and was like, oh, well, am I proud? And I was like, no, I don't think I am. I don't think I actually feel or experience pride. And I was actually like, no, I do feel pride. I'm actually just embarrassed to express it, right? And then as I pulled the thread on that, the kind of end journey of that was, in some regard, I realized that there's still a very small portion of me that wants to fit in, right? And we can all relate to this in different ways. And I was like, well, if I am proud about that, that's potentially arrogant. And that's potentially, not appropriate or acceptable socially, right? And pull the thread on that. And I'm like, well, pride as a function or the idea of fitting in as a function as a child is incredibly important because fitting in with your parents is what gets them their love and support. At least that's the rational equation you believe. But as we get older, we never lose that because there's no stimulus to tell us we don't need it anymore. So going all the way back to the question about parenting, ideally I'm able to help my children get to the point where they realize they don't need love or support from anybody else because they can love and support themselves. They can have their own pride and express their own pride, but not need to rely on any validation from anybody else. And in my current opinion, is that without experiencing, some in a controlled environment, some pain, disappointment, failure, these sorts of things, that's not necessarily achievable.
Love it. And it's interesting you use that word proud. As you reflect on the journey that's been, I know you got a long road ahead and lots more to conquer, but take a moment. What are you most proud of?
Yeah, it's that's a very emotionally challenging question to answer. I think I would definitely caveat the answer by saying I don't think anyone in their life performs at their best at all moments in time. And I don't actually even think that's necessarily really important because the standard of perfectionism would be destructive emotionally in a general sense. But I would say from a pride perspective, I never gave up, even though a lot of people didn't believe in me and I didn't necessarily have any of the emotional support or kind of support systems that I needed at that time. A lot of my journey, and I think a lot of my journey, and I think a lot of founders will be able to relate to the idea that a lot of the journey is individual. A lot of the journey is kind of just you. Even if you have people around you and supporting you, it's all in here, right? And so I think from my perspective, my biggest achievement effectively is simply just perseverance, because the idea of building something, you're effectively committing to living in some form of existential emotional crisis for years. And that's in my opinion, that's a very big thing to overcome. Now, not everyone gets an exit. That's okay, because I don't necessarily think that's the kind of key criteria for success. But for me, getting an exit was great, but it was to me, that was kind of a signal like, okay, well, the perseverance was worth it and right. And the perseverance is your achievement. It's not the money.
And the last question I have for you is, what's the impact that you want to make on this world?
Yeah, good question. I think it's varied a little bit, over the years as I've tried to, figure it out. But, I think I have two core streams. And when I say this outside of my goals as a husband and parent, as an individual or as a business person, the two things for me would be, one, I want to be very successful in business where success is measured by, kind of the size of impact that the organizations I work with, for, and own have on people. And I mean that even as simply as they employ people. That's good for their families. They sell products that hopefully people like and, get some sort of value from in their life, right? So that's probably the first aspect. And then the second aspect is a little bit more on the back seat at the moment, but, I really want to be able to help other people have the same degree of quote unquote success that I've had. And I don't mean that, to be small or big or the same from a monetary perspective, but, they feel like they can build something, and that the building or construction of that particular business then builds them a life that they can then be proud of, whatever that means to them at that point. And ideally they can do that without needing to suffer all of the unnecessary pain, on the way through. Like, to me, to be able to kind of almost take the burden off them in that regard would be very fulfilling.
Tobi, this has been incredible, mate. I don't usually do a sign-off, but I'm going to today. I absolutely love the way you're able to distill these complex problems down. I think it's really, really incredible. I can imagine the skill and the benefit it has to the founders that you're working with. You're clearly passionate about business, and I reckon it's pretty epic. You're one of those people in Australia that's able to communicate, and the reality, it isn't all Lambos and boats. Yeah. And I appreciate that, and I hope everybody today that listened will appreciate it as much. So, mate, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, man. Appreciate you having me.